Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are 8 potential Death Knight hero cards. In case you've been under a rock and missed the Frozen Throne announcement, it was revealed that all 9 player classes in Hearthstone are going to be receiving a legendary Death Knight hero card. As you can see previewed in this image right behind me, everybody's got some kind of Death Knight, new transformation, new look. This was the preview of what everybody's going to be all about. So what I decided to do is take the mold we saw with Deathstalker Rexxar as the very first real revealed hero card, and then see if I couldn't make my very own versions of a hero card for every single class in Hearthstone. So that's exactly what you're going to see in this video. Based on the teaser image and some of the clues within that image, I've gone and I've designed a Death Knight hero card for the 8 remaining classes, giving them powers and abilities that seem to be reflected in that preview art that we saw. I'm not going to tell you that each of these cards is perfectly designed or perfectly balanced, but I do think they are inspired by that artwork, make sense based on Death Knight lore in combination with some of the characteristics of the heroes as we already know them, and some familiar names from Death Knight talents and abilities in World of Warcraft as well. So all in all, I think this will be a fun and interesting little speculative look at what could show up when we see the remaining Frozen Throne Death Knight hero cards. So let's go ahead and jump into this list. At first, I want to start off with my new Jaina Death Knight hero card, which I'm calling Death Mage Jaina. And the reason I want to start off with Jaina is because in the trailer for Knights of the Frozen Throne, we got this really interesting visual of Jaina kind of transforming into a Death Knight. And we saw her utilizing Frost, we saw her using Mortal Coil, which is another, undead style, Death Knight style ability. So what I really thought for Jaina is that it seems like they're showing Jaina from all these different Death Knight lenses. She's also got a nice rune blade there as well. So clearly Jaina's kind of the main Death Knight in this alternate universe storyline, right? She's maybe just going to be like Arthas or a new Lich King, essentially. So I think Jaina needs to represent that by having all 3 of the different specializations available to Death Knights in World of Warcraft: Blood, Frost, and Unholy. So why not give her rotating hero powers when she transforms into her new Death Knight hero that match up with each of those specializations? So Death Mage Jaina herself as the hero card would be 5 mana in my mind with 5 armor. And of course, much like Deathstalker Rexxar, where she has some sort of instant effect that allows you to play her without totally sacrificing the game, this version of Death Mage Jaina would have a battle cry that destroyed a random enemy minion, which I think is actually rather balanced because it's great single target removal like a deadly shot from time to time, but it's not the perfect answer against a wide board of threats. It'd be really punishing and very slow to play this, so it kind of pigeonholes this into the right kinds of matchups and the right kinds of decks, and you could really only play this when you've been able to stabilize the board at least a little bit. Otherwise, you'd just be sacrificing too much opportunity. But of course, transforming into a new hero is really all about the hero power. Build a beast for Rexxar is totally insane, and I wanted to create some fun hero powers for Jaina that you would essentially rotate through, as we've seen with past adventure bosses and probably some tavern brawls. Whenever you press that button for the hero power, it transforms into the next hero power in line, and so on and so forth, which you'll see represented in the 3 hero powers here on screen. So first off, I think Jaina should have vampiric runes, which would essentially be the blood version of her hero power. And that would enable her, whenever you press that button, your spells for the remainder of that turn all have lifesteal. So you hit Vampiric Runes for 2 mana, you cast a Fireball. Not only does it deal 6 damage, but it also heals 6 health. Any damage you do, you get to recover that back. Also, Flame Strikes, for instance, would heal you for a ton of health, and you could combo this with a Flame Strike for 9 mana for a lot of life gain and a huge stabilization turn, which is really nice. And I wanted to give this particular one because it enables you to kind of swing and catch up, I think, more so than the other hero powers, which might be necessary when you play a card like Death Mage Jaina that lets you fall pretty far behind on the board and sacrifices a fair amount of tempo. You couldn't do both before turn 7, and then in a single turn, it'd be really hard to actually get a ton of value out of Jaina, the hero power, and a spell, so it probably takes a couple turns to roll up. So it wouldn't be completely overpowered in my mind, but still would give you some potential for a swing with a turn like Death Mage Jaina, Vampiric Runes, and then, for instance, Volcanic Potion if you killed 3 minions. you might get quite a bit of health back, 6 health, 5 armor, etc. That could be a really strong opening turn. Once you've used Vampiric Runes, then you get to move into the next hero power, which of course would be the Frost one, as you can tell from the name Pillar of Frost. And this would summon you a minion for 2 mana. Of course, it would also give you your next hero power in line. And by the way, real quickly, I should note that in envisioning this card, I don't think you should be able to use multiple hero powers in a single turn. Although technically, based on the rules of Hearthstone right now, when you refresh your hero power or change your hero power, you get to use it again. I think there would have to be some hard coding in here to prevent you, for instance, from using both Pillar of Frost and the next hero power, Army of the Dead, in a single turn. I think it would just have to lock itself off once you use one, and you'd have to wait for the following turn to actually use the next. But on Pillar of Frost itself, this would summon you an interesting little minion, as you can see there on the right side of the screen, which I'm calling the Pillar of Frost, which would be a 0/8 minion that has both Taunt and a new keyword that I'm designating Spell Soak, which would essentially be taunt for spells, and it wouldn't just be taunt for enemy spells, but Spell Soak would essentially soak any spell. So if you were the mage and you wanted to cast Fireball on the opposing hero's face, you would cast it, but instead you try to cast it, but instead it would force you to target the Pillar of Frost with your Fireball. Much like attacking a minion, you have to target a taunt minion before that attack can actually register. So this would be sort of the ultimate damage absorption tool, right? It doesn't come right away right after you play Deathmage Jaina, so you can't use it as an immediate stabilization tool, but it follows up. Minions have to run into it. Of course, it doesn't kill them because it's not making trades because it only has 0 attack, but also any spells that your opponent, targeted spells specifically, that your opponent uses would have to come, so it could help save you from that burst damage. It just makes it a very frustrating obstacle for your opponent to deal with, particularly if they don't already have a board of minions. It can become a frustrating thing for them to remove. And then finally, moving on to the third hero power, this would of course be the Unholy Death Knight hero power. And this one's a whopper. It's an 8 mana hero power that would summon you 7 ghouls, and ghouls would very simply just be 2/3 minions. So this would look a bit like Archthief Rafam's spell he gets where he fills the board with zombies, except in this case they'd be a little bit weaker, they'd just be ghouls. And a lot of people will say, oh my god, that's overpowered. Being able to summon 7 minions is insane for a hero power because it doesn't require a card, but ultimately you can only do it every 3rd turn in this environment, so it's not like it's going to be something that's happening all the time, because remember, you're cycling through these hero powers. And 3 health minions that do 2 attack, that's only 14 total. Remember, if you have other minions on the board, guess what? You don't get those ghouls. You can't play additional minions if your board is full. It's really hard to work with the remaining 2 mana in your deck and actually accomplish things. So I do actually think this is fairly well balanced, just given all the limiting factors that it would have. But also remember, these Death Knight hero cards are supposed to be really good. They're supposed to be win conditions. They're supposed to be really powerful deck-defining legendaries. Like Build a Beast Rexar, you're always getting an infinite stream of minions. Certainly you have to pay a lot for them, but they're really high-value minions. I think that this Army of the Dead hero power falls pretty closely in line with the same kinds of long-term value that Build a Beast would offer. And it's even slower, perhaps, because you only get to do it every 3rd turn. But at the end of the day, what I really like about Deathmage Jaina's design here, and what I was trying to go for at the very least, is that there are a lot of decisions to be made. There's a lot of different strategies and turn-by-turn tactics you have to take when utilizing these hero powers. For instance, Pillar of Frost might be great one turn, but you might also think you really desperately need it the following turn. You might really have to rush through to try to get Army of the Dead as soon as possible. You might want to save your Vampiric Runes for a turn you're expecting them to go wide on the board, and you know you can combo it with a Flame Strike. And if you accidentally use your Vampiric Runes too soon, then guess what? You've missed that opportunity to synergize it with Flame Strike, and you're stuck on a fairly useless Pillar of Frost that your opponent will just send a couple cheap minions into and continue hitting you in the face. So there's a lot of long-term, turn-by-turn decision-making in lining up these hero powers based on what you think your opponent's going to do. And actually, vice versa, your opponent has to understand when your hero powers are going to be available and make their turns based on that. So there's just a lot of kind of posturing back and forth between each opponent, trying to figure out and balance between these hero powers, which I think is a really skillful and interesting way to reward foresight in Hearthstone, which we don't always see because there is quite a bit of control in how these hero powers are utilized, and they're each unique enough and high impact enough but not overpowered that there are still a lot of decisions left to be made and a lot of influence that each player can actually take on the board in those given states. So all that said, This is my view of sort of the Lich King Jaina. Of course, I'm calling her the Death Mage Jaina. Pretty intricate as far as these cards are concerned, and I should just go ahead and say now, not all of these designs are going to be nearly this intricate. This is the most complex one, but that's because I think Jaina has clearly taken center stage in this alternate universe expansion, and I really wanted to do that justice and start off with a bomb here. So let's go ahead and move on to the next Death Knight hero card. So up next, we have what I'm calling the Grave Shard Garrosh, of course, the Death Knight warrior hero card. And this would be an 8-mana version that gives you 6 armor. And then you're also going to equip a weapon. That's the Battlecry effect for this one. And that weapon is called the Grave Shard, which I think, by the way, is an incredibly hilarious pun. And that is a 4/3 weapon that has a nice little bonus that freezes any enemy damaged by this weapon. And then finally, the new hero power you're going to get for Grave Shard Garrosh is every Control Warrior player's dream. It's called Shard Up, in the theme, of course, of Armor Up and Tank Up. But this is Shard Up because it's all about ice shards with Garrosh. And you gain 6 armor per hero power press. It does cost 3 mana, though, instead of 2. In the past, we saw things like the Justicar Trueheart upgraded warrior hero power that gave you 4 armor for 2 mana. So this is a slightly higher armor increase, but also a little bit more punishing when the mana cost is concerned. So first things of note, right? You can't Grave Shard Garrosh and hero power simultaneously. It was really important to me that you couldn't just gain 12 armor and develop this weapon. So Grave Shard Garrosh himself, you get the 6 armor by default, which is still pretty nice, but it's ultimately a tempo loss. You're spending 8 mana for a little bit of life gain and a weapon that would probably cost about 5 mana on average anyway. So you're probably not getting the full 8 mana in value. You're certainly not developing that much on the board. And the Grave Shard itself, even though it would probably legitimately cost 5 mana, is the kind of, maybe 6 mana by the way, but it's still the kind of card that takes 3 turns to actually get the full value of. So you're getting about 1/3 of the card's value on this first turn. So this is a pretty delayed gratification, delayed value kind of card. In other words, you put yourself at risk by playing this because you're not developing much and not accomplishing much for an entire 8 mana, giving your opponent a basic turn or 2 to really take advantage of that turn you nearly passed and develop a lot and gain a huge tempo advantage simultaneously. So this is really a Control Warrior, super late game style of play, fatigue style, building up those huge armor totals, etc. Of course, the freeze effect on the Grave Shard actually accomplishes that as well. You could stall out your opponent's face. You can trade into a minion if you want, of course, to kill it. You could trade into a huge minion just to stall it out for a turn or 2 while you build up those armor reserves. So a lot of cool little internal synergies here. And honestly, I just made this because this is the way I like to play Warrior. I love those huge armor totals. I love really slow Warrior games. Those are my favorite kinds of Hearthstone games in general. So I think this fits that mentality. It certainly strays away from the Pirate Warrior style of play that we see most commonly with Warrior now. This could probably still work in a Taunt Warrior kind of deck, except, of course, you have to balance hero powers between the Rag hero power and your new Shard Up hero power. So that could still be sort of a second out if you've gotten full value out of your Rag hero power from the quest and now you're looking to gain some life, or vice versa, you need some life first before you play the Rag hero power. This could be a nice complement to that. Or just build an all-new kind of Control Warrior that has fatigue as a win condition instead. So I really like the potential of this one, and the design goal was to make Control Warrior great again, which I think this does really well. And of course, the pun is fantastic. Grave Shard? Like graveyard, but an ice shard? Are you kidding me, guys? That's good stuff. So let's go ahead and jump on to the next Death Knight hero card. This time around, I've got a card called Void Anduin, and this one is very much inspired by the preview art, which we can see Anduin here is like being consumed by dark, shadowy void energy. He's being transformed, and this reminded me a bit of a priest ability in World of Warcraft called Surrender to Madness, where you essentially trade off the potential for really high damage increases for the risk of dying, and actually not just a risk, but the guarantee of eventually dying. So when you play Surrender to Madness in World of Warcraft, you get a nice DPS boost for a while, but then you die at the end of it. Even if the fight's still going, you risk dying much earlier than the fight actually ends, and that's exactly what this Death Knight hero card is trying to emphasize. So With Void Anduin, 5-mana card, when you play him, it's like you've permanently equipped a Cursed Blade. If you guys remember that card, all damage you take for the rest of the game is doubled when they hit your hero. So you gain a little bit of armor, sure, but all damage you take is doubled. When they hit you with that Arcanite Reaper, guess what? You're taking 10 damage instead of 5. But, of course, you're getting a totally bonkers free damage hero power, which I'm calling Void Blast, that is essentially a Pyroblast for 5 mana, clearly in the vein of Mind Blast. Some inspiration there, quite obviously. So, the idea here is you've reached a point in the game where you realize you need to finish it. And Priest has historically never had a great combo win condition kind of card, and this would finally give them that. So you reach a point where you say, okay, I'm all in. This game is going to end in the next few turns. I'm either going to kill him really quickly or he's going to kill me really quickly. So in some cases, this is just a 1-turn, 10-mana Pyroblast available for Priest, right? Because playing Void Anduin and then using hero power, that's 10 mana, and it's Pyroblast. We've seen before, of course, Pyroblast is a fairly balanced card. It's really good in Mage, obviously, and it would be good in Priest, too, but it's no better than Pyroblast at the end of the day. And if it doesn't kill them right off, if it takes more than 10 damage to kill them, you get to do another Pyroblast next turn for only 5 mana, so you can do 20 damage in 2 turns, which is absurd. But of course, your opponent has all the time in the world to kill you if that still doesn't kill them. So yes, there are going to be points where you can say, okay, they've got 17 health, I can play Void Anduin, and I'm guaranteed to kill them next turn. But of course, that means you've reached a point in the game where you're probably already ahead, and you've probably already stabilized. So I still think it's fairly balanced because your opponent had a chance to win. This is not the kind of thing that you can play really safely before turn 10. If you play this on turn 5, you only get 10 damage per turn. It might take 2 or 3 additional turns to kill them, and you're taking double damage the entire time, remember. And Priest doesn't have a lot of great stall cards. There's no Frost Novas necessarily. You can maybe play a couple cheap taunts, but you're still going to get hit in the face. So there's just this constant risk versus reward, constant calculation. How quickly can I kill this guy? Any healing available to your opponent completely disrupts your plans and almost ensures that you're dead. Now, clearly, this is the kind of card that walks a very fine line between being balanced or bad or overpowered, and any number tweak here or there could probably change that, and any meta could probably change that, and ultimately, this might just end up being too risky to be good, or maybe too powerful to be balanced. It's really hard for me to speculate on where those numbers would be, but I really like the idea here. I like the mechanic here. I like the idea of going all in, making that one-time super strategic decision, putting all your cards on the table, letting your opponent see as well exactly what's happening, and just letting you both duke it out and see who wins first. I think that's a mechanic Priest has never really had. Really, Hearthstone's never really had, and would be a lot of fun here. So essentially, win the game before Anduin is consumed by the Void, because this is Void Anduin. I'd like to see this one a lot. I don't know that it'd be good for the game. A lot of people are probably going to hate this design, but I think it'd be super fun to see. And although very decisive, still not random and not frustrating in my mind, so I think it'd still be a pretty cool card to see. So let's move on to the next card on my list, which probably couldn't be any more opposite than the previous card. I'm calling this the Icebringer Luther, much like he's called the Lightbringer traditionally. This is the Icebringer instead, because as you can see in that art, the Luther shoulder pad there has got this nice icy glow. He's got some ice sickles in his beard. He's got an icy weapon, so I figured clearly Luther is a Frost Death Knight that's all about the ice here. And that's exactly what this card and its hero power are all about. When you play Icebringer Luther for 6 mana, you're freezing every character on the board. That is both enemy characters and allied characters. So there's a little bit of a balancing act there. You're getting 8 armor. And then you get this new hero power called Glacial Advance, which is a passive hero power. So you don't have to push this button. This one just happens automatically. It's almost like an aura effect, kind of like things that happen with Caverns Below, for instance. We've seen passive hero powers in Avengers and stuff before, too. So we know that this is something that can be done. And this passive hero power is when all minions that you play, every minion you play, not minions you summon, but minions that you play, automatically have +4/+4 stats, and they're permanently frozen. That's right, they do not ever get to attack. So a lot of people are going to say, oh my god, what good are minions that can't attack? And that's exactly the point. That's what makes this card so fun. I think this is one of those cards that would be a really interesting deck building challenge and a sort of creative challenge. I don't clearly think this would be the kind of card that every deck would want to run. It'd be really, really terrible in a lot of decks, but I think some cards don't need to be just really good all the time. I think some cards need to fill a really specific niche or encourage some kind of specific sort of play, and that's exactly what this one would do, because think about this. Think about cards like Tyrian Fordring. Think about Wickerflame Burn Bristle. Think about Stonehill Defender. All these taunts that are available to Paladin, if suddenly they each had +4/+4, how scary would they be? Wouldn't Stonehill Defender as a 2/8 3-mana taunt that got you another taunt that was going to have +4/+4 be kind of ridiculous? Yeah, that would be crazy. It'd be so hard for your opponents to get through that. You could really just build a giant wall of ice on your side of the board. Of course, the downside, they don't ever get to attack, so you have to find some other way to win the game. That could be summoned minions, right? Because remember, this is minions you play, not minions you summon, so you could summon minions and buff them and protect them behind taunts. You could use weapons to do damage to your opponent's face. Just hammering them to find the damage you need. If you get weapons off of a really buffed Tyrian, you run a couple True Silvers, etc., along with stuff like Hammer of Wrath and Consecration, there's ways to actually put together some damage in Paladin. So you could rely on buffs, you could rely on spells and weapons. Alternatively, another great line of play would probably just be Fatigue. You could likely just fatigue out your opponent. You could throw in a single N'Zoth, because remember, N'Zoth is summoning minions, so if your opponent pushed through a Tyrian and pushed through a few other Death Rattle taunts here and there, you play N'Zoth, finally you got some actual Tyrian that can attack. So there's all kinds of cool ways to interact with this hero power. So it's kind of like Quest Rogue, right, where everything's getting these giant buffs, but charging minions would be absolutely useless in this environment. So it's not oppressive and frustrating to play against like I think it is in Quest Rogue. This would give your opponent a lot more control and the ability to dictate how things go, even though they'd have a mountain of stats to constantly push through depending on how you built your deck. I still think this is a really interactive and interesting way to use a permanent, pervasive aura-style buff like with Quest Rogue that would be a lot more fun. Plus, of course, just the theme and the idea here of just a giant wall of ice and Uther behind it is really fun and fantastic to me. So I really like this. And by the way, the battle cry for Icebringer Luther, it should be noted, is not a permanent freeze. That would just be for a single turn while you're setting up to essentially give you the time to really take advantage of Glacial Advantage. If it's ever a permanent freeze, it would say permanent freeze. This battle cry, of course, is just for a single turn. I should note that. So ultimately, I think this is one of my favorite designs just because it's kind of crazy and kind of goofy, but I still think it could work. Perhaps there's some really broken interaction I haven't thought of yet that would make this very frustrating, but if that's the case, I'm sure somebody in the comments will enlighten me. But until then, I think this is certainly going to be one of my favorite designs. This is a really, really fun one to me. So let's move on to Gul'dan here, and this is really one of the simpler designs, but I do actually think there are going to be some simple ones. Blizzard's clearly not going to make every card crazy and super imaginative like Deathstalker Rex are necessarily. And for Gul'dan, when I looked at his card art, you can see he sprouted these bone wings with this sort of red sinew between them, and he's got this really red glowing scythe, which you can't see quite all of in this artwork. But he very much to me looked like he was a blood Death Knight, and in World of Warcraft, Blood Death Knights are the tanky ones. They absorb a lot of health. They use a lot of vampiric style abilities. So I thought, of course, Blizzard's introducing the new keyword Lifesteal. They're probably going to plant one of these Death Knight hero cards with Lifesteal. And based on the artwork, it looks to me like Gul'dan looks the most vampiric, looks the most bloody style to me. So I think Gul'dan's probably going to be the Lifesteal hero card. Not to mention, I think they even addressed giving heal to both Warlock and Rogue, who don't have a ton of heal available right now, and both traditionally need heals, so it seemed to fit even better. So what we've done here is ended up with Blood Drinker Gul'dan, and I think Blood Drinker is the name of some ability for Death Knights. That's where I got that name. This would be a 4-mana Death Knight hero card, would give you 4 armor. The battle cry would instantly give all of your minions Lifesteal, so it would just apply a buff to them, where they each get Lifesteal, which absorbs health to you. So This could be something you played in the mid-game with a board of minions if you've already taken some damage. More likely this is something you play in the late game and are able to combo it out with another card or two or a couple minions, so you can more likely guarantee the value of that battle cry. It's clearly going to be better if you already have minions on board which can already attack to restore that health. So the way I'm envisioning this is, use the first half of the game to use your life tap hero power to do damage to yourself, generate a ton of resources, and then leverage those resources in the mid to late game by giving them life steal and restoring some health throughout the rest of the course of the game, where you become this really tanky Gul'dan that's difficult to kill. So the hero power here essentially just doubles down on the battle cry of the hero card. It would be called Blood Tap, much like Life Tap. It would summon you 2 minions so that you always have a little army of dudes to give life steal to, just in case you don't otherwise have a board. I want the hero power to still be valuable, because the hero power is also going to give all of your minions life steal all of the time. So you summon a couple dudes. They're just little 2/1s, as you can see there, little bloodworms I'm calling them. So they would potentially heal for up to 2 damage if they're killed, a little more if they get to attack. So in some ways, it kind of ends up looking like Justicar True Heart's Paladin hero power upgrade, where you get two minions, but you also increase the value of those minions quite a bit. So I do think that this is a very strong hero power in the scheme of 2-mana hero powers and just standard hero powers that we've seen. Not enough to win you a game on its own, but still, over a long period of time, adds into a lot of value and a lot of potential healing. Of course, also just giving other minions lifesteal adds up a lot too. Some people might, in fact, say too much, but I would argue that, remember, lifesteal doesn't actually give you any on-board value or tempo value. Lifesteal only adds 1 additional resource, which is your hero's health total. So it's not the kind of thing that wins you the game on the board. It can certainly keep you alive to stabilize and to generate value over a long period of time, but it's not a tempo kind of keyword. It's a more value kind of keyword. So I really don't think this one would overwhelm your opponents too much. I think it's pretty fair and pretty balanced, and in fact, maybe not even that good. This might be one of the worst hero cards I think I've developed here, which is unfortunate, because Warlock probably needs a better one at this point in the meta as we understand it. Now, clearly, I could have gone for a discard theme here, and that might, in fact, be what Blizzard does, because they really want discard to work in Warlock. But I thought, there's another legendary card coming to the class. Maybe they'll push it that way. Maybe they'll push it with some neutrals. I'd like to see the Death Knight hero card do something different and new, as opposed to just doubling down on discard mechanics once again. So I went in this direction instead, perhaps for better or for worse. So all that said, as far as Blooddrinker Gul'dan is concerned, probably not my favorite design, one of the simplest designs, but still introduces that new keyword in a fun and perhaps unique way that would be refreshing to see. So all that said, let's go ahead and move on to the next card. Up next is Rune Storm Malfurion, and I'm probably going to get a ton of hate for this one, and I kind of even hate it myself, but I do think it's pretty realistic as far as what Blizzard might design, because of course, randomness always shows up in Hearthstone. And when I looked at this Malfurion preview art, clearly he's holding up this giant claw that's essentially his rune blade, but it's a claw instead. But beyond that, if you look closely at his shoulders, you can't really see it in this image. But what are traditionally, I think, feathers or fur, looks a bit more like some kind of chaotic, shadowy energy back there. So I thought this one did need to have some chaos in it, and needed to be spell-oriented at the very least, and still have some attack, because it is all about the claw there in that image. So this is Rune Storm Malfurion, a 6-mana hero card that gives you 6 armor. It has the battle cry that gives your minions +1 spell damage, so some interesting synergies there right away when you have all kinds of different druid cards that can load up the board full of stuff. At 6 mana, it's not a natural complement to living mana or wisps of the old gods necessarily, but there are still clearly some ways. If you build a big board of stuff, you can leverage that with spell damage and cheap spells like Moonfires for some damage combos. So that would be one way to use this card. But then, of course, there's Runic Claw, the hero power, which is even more chaotic, and it's basically the Yogg-Saron of hero powers, which kind of sucks, but I do actually think would be fun. If not necessarily healthy for the game. So yes, I totally understand why this is bad for Hearthstone, but again, I think it's something Blizzard would make. They've given Mage all the randomness lately, so why not give a little bit to Druid this time around? Because Druid does have a really wide array of spells that do really different things, and I think it'd be awesome to see that captured in Runic Claw. 2-mana hero power. Gives you +1 attack still because this is a claw. You lose the defensive nature of your standard hero power, though, because, you know, this is the chaotic, aggressive Malfurion. He's not quite so at balance as he normally would be. But instead, you get a random Druid spell cast as well, and much like Yogg-Saron, all of these would have random targets, unless, of course, the spell itself dictated that it was on an enemy. For instance, Swipe says 4 damage on an enemy. So that would still always be an enemy. So there's a lot of high roll spells in Druid, like Swipe, for instance, that are guaranteed to hit enemies. There's things like Wild Growth that are guaranteed to be beneficial for you. Jade Blossoms, summon you a Jade Idol. All kinds of Druid spells would be mostly beneficial, but there's also a lot of risk here because things like Starfire, for instance, could just do 5 damage to your own face. You could give an enemy minion Mark of the Wild. If you look through the list of Druid spells, I would say roughly 2/3 of them are, well, let's say it this way. I'd say roughly 40% of them are beneficial most of the time. Probably the remaining 30% are neutral and could go either way, and then 30% often could go very, very wrong or be useless as well. So there's a bit of an array and a balance there as far as how much you could high roll with this. There's not really any super crazy spells that would always benefit you. Things like Moonblade Portal could summon you a 6 mana minion pretty often, but could also heal your opponent for 6 health. So there's even some balance there. So you could also, of course, just hard code in which spells are available for this kind of thing to reduce the variance, which would be nice. But I doubt Blizzard would do that. They'd probably just go all in. And some people will say, man, that's kind of crazy overpowered. Some Druid spells are so good. But if you look at something like Lord Jiraxis, for instance, he gets a 6/6 for 2 mana every turn. I don't think any of the high roll opportunities for Druid would be any better than that, and it would just be super chaotic. And with Rune Storm Malfurion, I think he has one of the least helpful battle cries. So for 6 mana here, you're really not doing much of anything. There's opportunities or chances in some games where you literally wouldn't do anything if you didn't have minions on the board. It's not like the Deathstalker Rexar that does 2 damage. It's not like some of the other cards that kill something or freeze something that I've designed. So a lot of risk and tempo loss in playing Rune Storm Malfurion himself, which really does help mitigate the upside of the potential high rolls from Runic Claw. So once again, not my favorite design. In fact, I think it'd be terrible for Hearthstone because it's so random, but I do think it's something Blizzard would implement and could very well be a feasible design. If not for Malfurion, then at least for one of these hero cards. So hopefully we don't see it, but don't be surprised if we do. And here we have Bone Storm Valeera. Of course, as you can see in Valeera's card art here, I noticed she was holding a blade that was clearly made out of bones. Presumably she has another one. Bone Storm is a Death Knight ability, so it seemed like a pretty natural fit. She's a 5-mana Death Knight hero card. She actually gives you 0 armor when she is played, but she does equip a Bone Blade, which, as you can see, is a giant 2-attack, 10 durability weapon, which pretty crazy. Hear me out. At the start of your turn, the Bone Blade also gives your hero armor that is equal to the weapon's durability, but it doesn't always just incrementally add like 10 durability. It sets it to the armor total of the durability. So if you have 3 armor, your Bone Blade's at 10 durability, it would set it to 10. You wouldn't go to 13. The wording here should make that pretty clear, but it's a little bit frustrating or a little bit confusing if you don't read it carefully. It's hard to word that correctly. So it sets your hero's armor to the durability of the weapon. And of course, this weapon can't be destroyed because I wouldn't want it just countered completely by Acidic Swamp Ooze, right? You can't counter a Death Knight hero card with Acidic Swamp Ooze because this one's really all about the weapon and using the weapon as a foundation to make it good. So although Bone Storm Valeera herself gives you 0 armor, the weapon at the start of the following turn would give you 10 armor, or if you used a weapon charge that turn, would give you 9 armor. So you're still getting some life gain from Bone Storm Valeera. Hear me out. I know there's a lot of people going, oh my god, wait. Just hear me out. There's also the hero power called Bone Storm, and this would allow you to deal 2 damage to all enemy minions, but it removes in the process 1 weapon durability. So essentially, you're kind of splintering off your Bone Blade, throwing the splinters out, and doing 2 damage to all enemy minions. So it's a bit like Consecration, I guess, but it doesn't hit the enemy hero. It just hits enemy minions, so a little bit worse than Consecration. And you do have to sacrifice a weapon attack to do so, but of course you also sacrifice a little bit of life gain. And remember, this Boneblade thing keeps going. You get that life gain every single turn. So as long as there's some durability, you're getting armor at the start of every single new turn. You get 10, you get 9, you get 7 because you use a charge in your hero power, you get 5, etc. So it can add up over the course of multiple turns to a lot of armor. And I know people are going crazy right now, and you're all saying, that is ridiculous, that's so much free armor every single turn. Your opponent's never going to be able to kill you. That hero power is super overpowered. You're getting a Consecration for 2 mana every single turn. And of course, there's people out there saying, you can't give a weapon 10 durability. Cards like Envenom Weapon and cards like Deadly Poison exist. You're going to give Valeera a totally insane weapon. I hear all of those concerns. Trust me. I realize you can build a 6/10 weapon with Deadly Poison. I realize you can just continually chip away at your opponent's board with Bone Storm. But remember, when you play this Bone Storm Valeera, all you're doing is developing a 2/1 weapon for that turn. So it costs you 5 mana to play a 2-attack weapon for a single turn, right? Because that's all you're getting. You can't use all 10 charges at once. So it's very risky to play Bone Storm Valeera in the first place because you're just not developing anything. You're giving your opponent essentially 2 turns to develop a board, the turn before you play Bone Storm Valeera and the turn immediately after you play Bone Storm Valeera, giving them 2 turns to develop stuff, to do damage to you, to generate resources. You're giving them a lot of time. And then, with stuff like giving Envenom Weapon or giving Deadly Poison to Boneblade, remember, that's only once per turn that you can attack with Boneblade. You can't kill multiple things per turn with Envenom Weapon. You can't do a ton of damage per turn. There's no Wind Fury effects on this Boneblade. So it takes a long time for that value to actually pay off. So Bone Storm Valeera herself, very slow. Boneblade itself, very slow. Now clearly it's giving you armor. You're getting an AoE defensive tool with Bone Storm, so you're able to hopefully recover with that time that you're granted. But Hearthstone, as we've learned time and time again, expansion after expansion, really slow, long-term value cards that require synergies and specific cards in hand to be really good. So you have to have the Deadly Poisons, you have to have the Envenom Blade, cards which are otherwise fairly weak, as we've learned, without this specific combination. Those kinds of cards just don't ever pan out as fantastic cards. So for them to work, I think they have to be a little bit overpowered. So I actually went too far with this one. I think I made it too good just because it is rather slow. And the Pirate Warriors of the world are just going to kill you by the time you do anything good with Bone Storm Valeera. They're just going to develop too much value and you're going to be dead. So I decided Rogue really needs 2 things. They need good AoE and they need life gain, and that's exactly what this card gives them. It gives them Bone Storm for consistent AoE. Of course, you can only ever do 2 in a turn, so if they play big stuff, it doesn't help you. If they play big stuff against your Boneblade, it doesn't help you. But you also get that consistent life gain of the armor coming back every turn. So it gives Rogue 2 really desperate needs. And of course, there's this really cool balancing act between Bone Storm and Boneblade. It's like, yeah, I can use this Bone Storm, but I sacrifice some armor on the following turn. I can use a weapon charge, but I sacrifice some armor or a potential Bone Storm in the future. So I really like that kind of value trade-off where you're constantly making decisions about which is better. Now, maybe Boneblade would be better as a 2/6, a 2/8. Just trim it down a little bit. I can buy into that logic. That's fine. I'm not trying to balance these cards perfectly on a number-by-number standpoint. It's really hard to envision how all those things work. But the idea here, the core mechanics of this, are really a nice fit for Rogue, I think, and encourage some really good decision-making for both players on both sides of the field, which are cards that we need more of in Hearthstone. So I'm still actually fairly happy with this design, despite all the potential problems that it could certainly create. And that said, let's move on to my last Death Knight hero card. This one is the Shadow Frost Thrall. I looked at this Thrall card art and I saw a couple things here. First off, you see the white skull painted on his face. Reminded me a lot of Ner'zhul, essentially, or like Shadow Moon style orcs. So I wanted to include Shadow Frost in the name. You can also see his shoulders. He has these sort of floating ice shards with some sort of black or purple shadow chaos style energy. It looked very like chaotic and crazy. So I wanted something that was a little bit energetic, a little bit, chaotic, I guess is really the only word that summarizes it, a little bit dangerous. So, but also still used frost as a theme, clearly, because this is a Death Knight that has embraced the way of frost. So for Shadow Frost Thrall, it's a 6-mana card. It gives you 4 armor. Battle Cry says freeze all enemy minions, so just a Frost Nova, essentially. But it has an overload of 4, which sounds really punishing, right? Because essentially that means this is a 10-mana Frost Nova that gives you 4 armor. That sounds really terrible. But as you look into this hero power, I think you'll see why that overload starts to make more sense. The hero power here is Mana Shatter. It's a passive hero power. And what it does is at the start of your turn, overloaded mana crystals are summoned as frost shards. So when you play Shadow Frost Thrall, you've overloaded 4 mana crystals. You go into the next turn, you have 4 overloaded mana crystals in your tray. Your hero power is a passive hero power. So what it does is it summons those overloaded mana crystals as frost shards. So a bit like what we've seen with living mana. You still can't use that mana. You can only use the remaining true active mana crystals. But essentially this gives your overloaded mana crystals some inherent value. And as you can see here from frost shards, these are 2 mana, 2/2 minions. The mana cost isn't really relevant. But they're 2/2 minions that at the end of your turn deal 2 damage to a random enemy. So really what you're getting with Shadow Frost Thrall is essentially 4 2/2 minions, or a total of 8/8 in stats, that all do 2 damage to a random enemy. Can be either an enemy minion or, of course, the enemy's face. You're getting 8/8 that does 8 damage in stats, which starts to look a bit like a Ragnaros. And suddenly you see why this card is actually kind of crazy good. And of course, that passive hero power lasts for the remainder of the game. So every overloaded mana crystal for the rest of the game is constantly recycled as these little frost shard minions. And suddenly you have a swarm of dudes that are very, very difficult for your opponent to deal with because they just constantly chip away damage. Chaotically throwing frost shards or, little icicles out is the idea thematically here. So it essentially gives overload a way to be beneficial to you, but always on a 1-turn delay. So essentially the turn you're being punished by the overload, you're actually also being rewarded by the overload simultaneously. So clearly the idea here is to build an overload style deck. And that's very scary. I hear you. I get it. It's very scary because we've seen cards that benefit from overload, like Tunnel Trog, for instance, in the past, really steamroll out of control and make Shaman very, very powerful. I agree that that's still a bit of a risk with this card because you're getting a lot back for an overloaded mana crystal, and ultimately overload is something you kind of want anyway because you're already receiving a benefit for using that overload. Like you're getting more stats, you're getting a stronger effect, you're getting a card that's cheaper than it should really be. So you're kind of mitigating the downside with an upside, so it's not really a downside at all. So you're getting double the upside. You're getting the tempo of the overload, but you're also getting the minions on the back end. So there's a very fine line there whether or not this would be balanced. I completely understand, but I really like the idea of it, and I think it would still be okay because there just right now aren't that many really strong overload cards. They don't always fit together really nicely necessarily either. Sure, there's Lightning Storms, which is always going to be a staple in Shaman that would work really well. There's Earth Elemental, which is a really big overload card. But it just reduces your flexibility a lot, and it puts a lot of control in the hands of your opponent because they're like, look, I know they're going to summon 5 Frost Shards next turn, but have virtually no mana left. So if I save this Consecration, guess what? I probably just win the game. Not to mention Shadow Frost Thrall himself is a 6-mana card that really only casts the Frost Nova, so you're giving your opponent more time to just develop a ton of resources, right? They get to play a lot of stuff. They can play things that don't play particularly well into the incoming Frost Shards either, so you're giving a lot of power back to them when you play this, and you're playing a very slow tempo card, so you might just sometimes lose the game to the Pirate Warriors once again if you try to run Shadow Frost Thrall. So much like a few of these other cards, really the meta, I think itself, balances this in a little bit, just because you couldn't build a super greedy Overload deck and still be competitive in Hearthstone. So the card itself could sometimes be overpowered, but if you consider it within the context or within the environment of the actual game, the actual ladder, what you'd be playing against, you'll start to realize some of these cards just aren't that overpowered outside of that vacuum where you're really closely analyzing them. So clearly you could tweak some numbers. Maybe the Frost Shards are 1 mana 1/1s to deal 1 damage to a random enemy, right? Like that could be a really quick way to hone in on the power level here. I'm not trying to answer all those questions and refine every single number. I'm just mostly designing mechanics here and what I think would be really cool ideas. And I'd like to see Shaman embrace that chaotic energy of Overload and do something cool like this to make Overload a more fun build-around style mechanic than it currently is, which it sort of just feels like a secondary accessory to Shaman, not core to the class identity. And I think this would really help hone that and bring it in and make it a part of Shaman. So I'm actually pretty happy here with Shadow Frost Thrall, even though it might be a tad overpowered. And there you go, guys. Those are my designs for the 8 remaining Death Knight hero cards. Some pretty crazy stuff. These were a ton of fun to make. I'm sure some are bad. I'm sure some are too overpowered. I'd like to know what you guys think, though. Which cards were your favorite? Which ones would you love to see in the game? Which ones, Rune Storm Malfurion, would you hate to see in the game, etc., etc.? I'd love to get your take on all these cards because I did spend a lot of time making them. And if they're absolutely awful, I'd love to hear about it. And if they're a little bit awesome, well, that wouldn't be too bad to hear about either. So guys, do leave your thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.